I was a little kid, sometimes my grandfather would talk about World War II. He said everyone was so happy when Germany finally started getting bombed. At last, they were getting a taste of what they had been doing to us and to so many others. I always saw my grandfather as such a good and honest man, a man of great integrity, a peace-loving man. Yet he was happy about such widespread violence, indiscriminately blanketing an entire populace with fire and fury. But consider the context of his time. Consider what the Nazis had done up until then, what they put people through, and the only tools we had to stop it. When faced with great injustice, even the best of us will turn to violence. Even the best of us will be glad for violence. That's what I don't want it to come to. You should do everything in your power to avoid the point in which violence becomes necessary. Because only then, only when all peaceful avenues have been exhausted, can violence be justified. And that's a hell of a thing, because violence is ugly. We have a natural revulsion to it. It takes a lot of anger to overcome such disgust. A beating, a stabbing, a shooting can all be such disturbing things to see. That's when violence is at its most explicit and visceral, direct physical contact between opposing people. Far more violence can be done with the stroke of a pen, however. A pen that seals fates, because after all, the pen is mightier than the sword. Violence can be cloaked by a labyrinth of bureaucracy. But that only works for so long before people start to understand who is really affecting their lives and why. Propaganda has limits. It can only contradict material reality up until a certain point. So you can't rely on that forever. At a societal level, those with the real responsibility to avoid violence lie not with the people, but with the powerful. Those with power can freely choose to do what's right or wrong. The choice is yours, but the results are quite different. You have the power to take it all. But the world that would result from that is not a world you would want to live in. During the full 100 years of the 20th century, there were 360 school shootings in the United States. We are still in the first quarter of the 21st century, and yet so far in the 21st century, there have been 575 school shootings. Already far more than the entirety of the 20th century. Now, some of these school shooters were inspired by each other and copied each other, yet they were all universally hated. Everyone was disgusted by what they did. They were seen as monsters. Soon it became anathema to even speak their names. They terrified regular people, people like myself, as I have a child in school. Even if I didn't, though, I would still be horrified by it. Everybody knows that children don't deserve to be killed. Well, most of us know that. Yet despite how hated those killers were, it kept happening. And now it happens more than ever before. So here's a hypothetical for you. If it can become a trend to commit an act of violence that makes you hated, can it become a trend to commit an act of violence that makes you beloved? It seems to me like that's at least possible, if not likely, and I say that without moral judgment of my own. I'm not advocating it, I'm examining it and presenting it for consideration. There are around 20,000 murders per year in the United States. Of course, you don't hear about the vast majority of them. People like my brother-in-law, who fought back against a couple of muggers and was shot in the head for it. I believe they got away with about $20. There was a single paragraph about it in a local newspaper. That's it. The murderers were never caught. The police did not seem to care all that much. To them, it was boring, routine. It was as if they already knew the killers would never be caught. They were already written off. But it's a very different story when someone of note is killed. What I saw among the general public recently after the shooting of the United Healthcare CEO was quite unprecedented. People were certainly united, weren't they? The media tried to condemn it, and some tried to twist it into partisan politics, but that did not seem to work. Neither right nor left mattered. People were united across the political spectrum, which is unusual because that devious spectrum itself exists to divide us and to keep us fighting amongst ourselves rather than for our own self-interests. It's exceedingly proficient at pitting us against each other. But for a moment, out of the countless shootings in this country, there was actually one that most of the public, at the very least, did not mind, regardless of political affiliation. It was a unification of sentiment I had not seen since the killing of Osama bin Laden, and he was guilty of an act of terrorism that took 3,000 lives. What if your death had a similar reaction? That's a hell of a thing, isn't it? Imagine millions of people either celebrating your death or at the very least not minding it. It's a scary thought. I would imagine that it's at least disconcerting for the peers of that CEO, especially as they try to live in a society that cheered for his killer. A society that is more heavily armed than ever before. I fear that his peers will take away the exact wrong message, which will be the status quo plus more security. To the peers of that CEO, I don't want to see you be killed. I don't even want there to be a death penalty. But I'd much rather see you be the change so that people have no desire to kill you. And I want that to be the reason that you are no longer in danger. It wasn't like the CEO was a well-known man, not like Osama bin Laden was. We all know that the vast majority of people who cheered for his death did not know his name the day before he was killed. If you asked anyone on the street who Brian Thompson was, they wouldn't know, and a lot of them probably still wouldn't know. But what they do know is what the company he worked for does, and that's all they need to know. So it's not even about personal hatred. That CEO could have been anybody. It was what he represented that mattered. It was what he agreed to do in his profession that angered everyday, regular people. When your chosen profession affects the lives of millions of people, ethical behavior is absolutely mandatory. But what if your profession itself makes ethical behavior impossible? Well, then nobody should be doing it in the first place. And the mere act of doing it becomes an indictment. What if more people died because of you than because of bin Laden? Not because of any sort of ideological hatred, not because of explicit, highly visible violence like flying planes into buildings, but merely because it's part of doing business. A stroke of the pen. It's so much more civil, isn't it? It allows you to pretend that you have the moral high ground. We have the ability to save your life, but somebody else's pen said no. We have the ability to stop your pain. But somebody else's pen said no. It may seem ridiculous to compare that to Nazis and jihadists, but the only real difference is in their reasons. They're all overseers of pain, suffering, and death. Some do it because of hatred, while others do it for profit. It's nothing personal to them, but of course, to you, it's the most personal it can be. It's your life. In the end, though, no matter how someone dies, the fact that they died carries an impact, and that works both ways. 10 days after the United Healthcare CEO was killed, the billionaire founder of the Mango fashion company died in a hiking accident. He fell 150 feet to his death. The comments I saw on that news story could not exactly be described as sad. What's going on here? Did these commenters know that man? Did they wake up feeling wronged by that man? Did they even know his name before that day? Probably not. What he did do, however, was accumulate billions of dollars during a time when many of us are struggling. That's what those who did not care about his death understood. Now, some people will mistake that for envy, but that's far too simplistic. It's okay to be rich and successful, but the degree and the context matters. If a lion was gorging himself on a buffalo carcass and swatted away the other members of his pride, that would not be an accurate analogy to describe what's currently going on in our society, to accurately describe it. The pride would have to be on the brink of starvation, and the greedy lion would have to be hoarding thousands of buffalo carcasses, more than he could ever eat, and swatting the pride away from all of those carcasses nonetheless. And if the pride should kill their own buffalo, then the lion would take it and add it to his forbidden mountain of carcasses. We would immediately recognize the absurdity of such a lion. We would not try to defend it as ambition or admirable in any way. It's only partially about healthcare, you see. That's what others need to understand. I'll get into that shortly. But as far as healthcare goes, for the longest time, we were made to believe bad and expensive healthcare with insurance company battles was just a part of reality, and that it was unrealistic to expect otherwise. It was fantasy to live in a world where you could receive quality healthcare and not be charged a lot of money for it. But then the internet happened and the world got a lot smaller, a lot more connected, and we started hearing about how other countries have free healthcare. So then they started arguing that it's not exactly free because they have to pay for it in their taxes. But as it turns out, it would be less expensive to pay for it through your taxes than through a bloated, greedy middleman that can base your medical care on their profits. It's fully understood that a person with limited means can easily be discouraged from and even incapable of legally challenging a massive corporation, especially while going through serious medical issues. After all, such corporations are bigger than any of us. They're quasi-governments. Even though they're not alive, they're classified as people. But everyone understands that's a legal fiction to protect the people behind them. Some of you watching this video make around $30,000 a year or less. The CEO of United Healthcare made $30,000 a day. His job was to determine the best possible ways to choose money over stopping pain, suffering, and death. For that, he made $30,000 a day. He did not die while attending a patient's meeting. He died while attending an investor's meeting. Those close to him defended him by claiming that indeed there are problems with the way we do health insurance in this country. But that's not his fault, they say. It's the system's fault. Nobody forced him to do that job, though, and nobody forced that particular company to be the very worst offender of the system. You can't be the very best at profiting off the system and then claim to wish the system were different. That's an obvious lie. And if the very people in charge of the system can't be blamed, then who can be? They're the reason healthcare is so expensive in the first place. The CEO of the parent company of United Healthcare said that he's super proud to be part of an organization that does so much good for so many. Every one of us regular people recognizes that as PR bullshit. It couldn't be further from the truth. He also said this.
And we make sure that care is safe, appropriate, and is delivered when people need it. And we guard against the pressures that exist for unsafe care or for unnecessary care to be delivered in a way which makes the whole system too complex and ultimately unsustainable. So we're going to continue to make that case. We will continue to do the work we do and encourage you to tune out that critical noise that we're hearing right now. And what we know to be true is that the health system needs a company like United Health Group, and it needs people like Brian within it.
Now consider the context of that quote. First of all, insurance companies have no business making medical decisions to decide what's necessary. And second of all, United Health Group makes record profits every single year, while Americans struggle more and more every single year. So I don't want to hear about his version of unsustainability. What he really means is that the level of profit margin that they currently enjoy would be unsustainable. So people are going to have to be sacrificed on that altar, the altar of sustained high profits. That's what he really means. And the news media flooded us with puff pieces about how wonderful this other CEO, Brian Thompson, was, and how the positive reaction to his death was appalling, or was only a fringe few. That's a lie. It wasn't a fringe few. They're desperately trying to craft a narrative right now, one that paints regular people as monsters. Though I would not celebrate his death or anyone else's death, I don't really blame people who do. They've been through worse than I have. You can't expect them to be emotionless robots, emotionless like the people who seal their fates with the stroke of a pen. That may look civil, though it's anything but. In this CBS piece, it says that at an investor meeting last year, the CEO of United Healthcare outlined, quote, value-based care to keep patients healthy rather than focusing on treating them when they get sick. CEOs love lying to investors. I'm fully covered under United Healthcare. This year, after I got flu shots for my whole family, you know what else I got? A bill in the mail for the flu shots. All these people do is lie. And that's nothing compared to what others deal with. I can't even imagine the agony of dealing with financial battles, thinking you're covered, while having to endure a medical crisis, or watching a loved one endure a medical crisis while you have to worry about losing everything you have. But you better not get emotional about it. That's just abhorrent and un-American. They're ambitious business professionals, you see, so Watch your loved one wither away along with the rest of your life savings. And for goodness sake, don't be so crass as to show a lack of concern when misfortune falls upon those in charge of that system. How dare you? That's what they're really telling you. Take it and be polite about it. Because if people get angry, then it's not because of what's being done to them, no, but because you incited them. That's the talking point, see? The truth is, though, this is only a fraction of what's happening. Healthcare is only one aspect. What you have to understand is that getting away with unethical behavior directly correlates to how many people you affect. Wrong one person, and you might get away with it, sure. Like those guys who killed my brother-in-law. Wrong millions, and you have a much bigger problem to navigate. When somebody wrongs you, there's a visceral feeling of violation. If someone points a gun in your face and takes your wallet, it's a feeling that stays with you for the rest of your life. Coming home and finding that your house has been broken into is a grotesque feeling. Some stranger coming into your life and taking something from you, something that you worked for, can feel like a partial death, and in a way it is. How many hours, days, or even years of work did it take to purchase that which was stolen from you? In a way, all that time you worked was stolen too, and time is the only thing you truly have in this world. People only tolerate that up until a certain point, and after that point they become ready, willing, and able to fight for what they have. Videos of robberies are easy to spread online. They anger people. But if the robber is thwarted somehow, people really love to see that. It's a very visible crime, and as such, a lot of people fear it and prepare for it by arming themselves. And there is very little compassion for criminals willing to threaten or commit violence against others to steal their belongings. In my video called Weaponizing Young Men with Fear, I talk about how people have poor risk assessment abilities, how they will irrationally fear things far less likely to happen than things far more likely to happen. That applies here as well. In the United States, every year, around $53 billion is stolen from people. Robberies only account for $0.34 billion in theft per year out of the $53 billion. That means robberies only account for 0.64% of what is stolen from Americans per year. That's what you see on the news and on Twitter and what politicians use to sell themselves as the solution for rampant crime. So who on earth is stealing the other 99%? Well, $39.2 billion of the $52 billion is what companies steal from their employees per year. That's 74%. 74% of the theft in the United States per year is companies stealing from their employees. That's minimum wage violations, overtime violations, rest break violations, and off-the-clock violations. The truth is that you do not have to worry about the poor stealing from you nearly as much as you have to worry about the wealthy stealing from you. During the summer of 2020, there was widespread outrage and condemnation of the looting and rioting that caused $2 billion worth of losses that year. $40 billion is stolen from us every year, quietly and deceptively, by companies. That's 20 summers of 2020, every single year. not taking from companies like a Walgreens that was smashed up or like a bunch of TVs taken from a Walmart. No, that 40 billion is what those companies steal from us, the people. There's just no videos of that to spread around online. It happens in much more boring ways, via paperwork or lack thereof, but it happens nonetheless. Imagine 20 of those violent summers every year, not in commercial districts, but in neighborhoods. That's the material cost affecting us. It does not happen with a crowbar or a Molotov. It happens with a pen. You know what's even more infuriating? That 40 billion is pennies. Pennies compared to what else is stolen from you. But it's not included in these statistics because technically it cannot be classified as stealing because it's legal. It's legal theft. But not just legal theft, it's also legal vandalism too. It's what companies and governments are doing to your environment. Now, some of you are rolling your eyes right now simply because the propaganda has not caught up to the material reality in ways that are obvious to everyone. Some people can still afford to deny it as they fall back on all the lies they've been told, but eventually that propaganda will be obsolete, and you'll be faced with the harsh reality of what has been done. There will be climate refugees and resource wars, the likes of which we've never seen before. And the people best equipped to survive it will be the ones who caused it. The people who lied to you and told you that it isn't happening were some of the first people to discover that it is happening. That's how egregious their lies were. They knew it was a problem long before most of us did. They knew what they were doing, but did it anyway, and then told you that what they were doing wasn't a problem. Citizens United versus the Federal Elections Commission was a 5-4 Supreme Court decision in 2010, which made it so that any corporation or nonprofit organization could spend as much money as they wanted on any political campaign, and it could be dark money, meaning that they didn't have to report it. This is, of course, how your government is bought. Incidentally, insurance company PACs donated $23 billion to candidates in 2024. What's interesting is that before this decision was made, there was actual bipartisan debate on climate change. But after that decision, the climate change debate became divided sharply along political lines. The facts don't care about your politics. They're true regardless of who you vote for. But the debate curiously changed after 2010. This is also around the time that a lot of propaganda campaigns around climate change started, usually promoted by politicians. But politicians aren't scientists. The media isn't science either. Never confuse a politician's lie or a media headline as actual scientific data. One of the more popular pieces of propaganda is that scientists are paid a lot of money to skew the science, and that the moneyed interests are in favor of green energy. This is the same tactic as a pedo who accuses everyone else of being pedos. It diverts attention because it makes it look like they care about the crime while being guilty of it. Look at what happened after the Citizens United Supreme Court decision. Oil and gas expenditures to Republican campaigns skyrocketed, and just enough money was given to Democrats to make them ineffective opposition. They started giving a hell of a lot of money away. So, what were they getting in return? Hundreds of billions of dollars in subsidies. Their investment paid off quite well for them. Not only do they make record profits, but they get tons of your tax dollars because the corporations and the government are working together like the mob. If you don't play ball, then they fund your political opponent and get them in office. Slip the people in control of the money some cash, and even line the government with your executives, and in return they deregulate and send you tons of subsidies that result in billions of dollars, which causes a market advantage that is about as far as you can get from free market capitalism as you could possibly imagine. Yet they want you to believe that anyone who is resistant to this corruption is somehow a hardcore communist, un-American, or anti-business. It's ridiculous Red Scare tactics. Get the regular people to fight among themselves, cause people to complain about the inner city mother of five getting food stamps and money for rent, which causes people to call her a welfare queen, while billions of your tax dollars are being siphoned off to the robber barons that are literally destroying your children's futures. And just like the pedo who cries pedo, they also cry about the dangers of wealth redistribution while conducting the most massive wealth redistribution that has ever occurred, complete with too big to fail bailouts, which are more aptly described as handouts. Privatize the profits, socialize the losses. This is reverse Robin Hood on a massive scale. But cheap energy is good, right? It helps everyone, doesn't it? We need oil, don't we? It's included in so many products. Look, the only reason we supposedly need as much oil as we do is because our society was built around needing the oil industry. We built an incredibly inefficient society around cars rather than people. So we need to commute everywhere, wasting billions of dollars and years of our lives. We never needed to do that before, but we need to now, you see, because of the world that was built for us to inhabit. A concrete world of planned obsolescence, deliberate inefficiencies, and complete reliance on those who made it this way. It's like giving your doctor a baseball bat and letting him beat the shit out of you so that you need him to keep you alive. That's what we're doing right now. It's lunacy. But this is the world in which we were raised, so it feels normal to us. In truth, it makes no sense for us. It makes perfect sense for them, though, for the few. It's an advanced form of widespread robbery. You are living in the midst of the biggest criminal empire that has ever existed, and you are being robbed every single day, not by the poor, but by the wealthy. And I'm not talking about people who are merely well off, not your rich uncle, not your doctor, and not the small business owner who makes a good living. It's done by the people and companies with enough wealth to buy countries. The only reason it's not called criminal is because they paid off the people who make the laws. The criminals made it legal to do crime, and you are the victim. You're the mark. You just don't know it because it wasn't done with a gun or a knife. It was done with the stroke of a pen. So it looks so civilized. What's the result of all this? Well, the result is a massive hoarding of wealth. 80% of our country, 80%, has 7% of the wealth. The top 10% have 70% of the wealth, much of that being concentrated in the top 1%. That's not the result of a meritocracy. That's not a fair and free market at work. That is the result of corruption. The bottom 80% of our country that gets only 7% of the wealth has some of the most intelligent and hardworking people. 7% does not reflect their worth. 57% of Americans cannot afford a $1,000 emergency expense. That's 200 million Americans. who can't afford $1,000. If every single one of them had a $1,000 emergency expense right now, it would amount to $200 billion, which is less than half of what Elon Musk alone has. But didn't he make money from electric cars, which are better in terms of climate change? Well, Musk made much of his money by selling carbon credits so that other companies can pollute more. He essentially turned Tesla into a pollution company while maintaining green energy bragging rights. The bottom line is that our entire country is a store that's being looted, and it's almost empty. We got 7% left, and they're not going to leave that on the table either. That's not the nature of greed. Cancer is not rational. If it were, then it wouldn't kill you. It would grow just enough so that you could keep living, and thus the cancer could keep living too. But that's not how cancer works. And greed is like cancer. They will just keep taking and taking until it kills our society. I could show you some graphs like the ones in this older video.
Here's that ideal we asked everyone about. Something like this curve. This isn't too bad. We've got some incentive, as the wealthiest folks are now about 10 to 20 times better off than the poorest Americans. But hey, even the poor folks aren't actually poor, since the poverty line has stayed almost entirely off the chart. We have a super healthy middle class with a smooth transition into wealth. And yes, Republicans and Democrats alike chose this curve. 9 out of 10 people, 92%, said this was a nice, ideal distribution of America's wealth. But let's move on. This is what people think America's wealth distribution actually looks like. Not as equitable, clearly, but for me, even this still looks pretty great. Yes, the poorest 20 to 30% are starting to suffer quite a lot compared to the ideal, and the middle class is certainly struggling more than they were, while the rich and wealthy are making roughly 100 times that of the poorest Americans and about 10 times that of the still healthy middle class. Sadly, this isn't even close to the reality. Here is the actual distribution of wealth in America. The poorest Americans don't even register. They're down to pocket change, and the middle class is barely distinguishable from the poor. In fact, even the rich between the top 10 and 20 percentile are worse off. Only the top 10% are better off. And how much better off? So much better off that the top 2 to 5% are actually off the chart at this scale. And the top 1%, this guy, well, his stack of money stretches 10 times higher than we can show. Here's his stack of cash, restacked, all by itself. This is the top 1% we've been hearing so much about. So much green in his pockets that I have to give him a whole new column of his own, because he won't fit on my chart. 1% of America has 40% of all the nation's wealth. The bottom 80%, 8 out of every 10 people, or 80 out of these 100, only has 7% between them. And this has only gotten worse in the last 20 to 30 years. While the richest 1% take home almost a quarter of the national income today, in 1976, they took home only 9%, meaning their share of income has nearly tripled in the last 30 years. The top 1% own half the country's stocks, bonds, and mutual funds. The bottom 50% of Americans own only 0.5% of these investments, which means they aren't investing. They're just scraping by. I'm sure many of these wealthy people have worked very hard for their money. But do you really believe that the CEO is working 380 times harder than his average employee? Not his lowest paid employee, not the janitor, but the average earner in his company. The average worker needs to work more than a month to earn what the CEO makes in 1 hour. We certainly don't have to go all the way to socialism to find something that is fair for hardworking Americans. We don't even have to achieve what most of us consider might be ideal. All we need to do is wake up and realize that the reality in this country is not at all what we think it is.
Notice the comments, all understanding how much worse it is now than it was then, and expressing concern about that. Graphs are nice, but for some people they just don't properly convey the message. So allow me to show you a video that makes a physical demonstration of it.
This is what wealth inequality in the United States actually looks like. This grain of rice represents $200,000. That's about the median net worth of a citizen in the United States, which means if you took our population and drew a line split down the middle, about half of us have this much or less. Half of us have this much or less. Just going to put that down right there, 1 grain of rice. This is $1 million, 5 grains of rice. When most of us think rich, we think of $1 million. This is $100 million. This is about the net worth of CEOs who delay and deny care for sick Americans. This is also about the net worth of CEOs who tell Americans to eat cereal if they can't afford food for their hungry kids. This is $277 million. This is Elon Musk's personal investment in the 2024 elections. This is what he spent to buy the presidency. This is $1 billion. This is the approximate net worth of Vivek Ramaswamy. Only 800 people in the United States have this much money or more. As a frame of reference, think about how many people you went to high school with. Only 800. And this is $6.3 billion. This is the approximate net worth of Donald Trump. He recently said in an interview that he doesn't think he can bring grocery prices down after running his campaign on a promise to do so. He also blames immigrants who have less than a fraction of a grain of rice each for a lot of the financial troubles facing our country. And this is Elon Musk. He's worth $400 billion. He spent $277 million on the 2024 election cycle, while we have homeless veterans on our streets and hungry kids in our schools. This is what actual wealth disparity looks like in America. Each grain of rice is worth $200,000. And Elon Musk also wants to fire 75% of our federal workforce, which includes a majority of veterans. He wants to fire 75% of these people who have a single grain of rice trying to earn a living and feed their families because he says that that's inefficient. Musk, Ramaswamy, and certain members of Congress also want to consider cutting social welfare programs that support people with less than a single grain of rice from going into poverty. They want to look at cutting these programs because they believe that that's inefficient.
You have no idea the depths of the corruption, the depths of the destruction being wrought as we fight amongst ourselves. No more culture war. Abandon the bullshit culture wars. Our future is being robbed from us. It's gone even beyond a class war, because even the upper class has less than they used to, as it's all being siphoned to the tippy top. But here's the thing. Earlier, I said that those with power are the ones who can choose, and they can, but only until a certain line isn't crossed. And they're dangerously close to that line. The truth is that their power is based on our consent. Their power is largely an illusion. We have the real power. We are the many. We cannot be defeated. The only way to defeat us is if we defeat ourselves. You think they don't know that? Don't do that. Don't play by their rules. I'm begging you. Let's end this right-left divide and unite. I know how hard that must be. I know the grudges are many and the scars are deep. I've given in to that fight myself over the years. But that's all culture war division. The real problem is far more material. I think we can all get on board with stopping that. We can all get on board with focusing on that problem and demanding that these giant corporations and moneyed interests stop intruding upon our lives, shaping our laws and taking our money, our environment, and our culture. This means realizing that these billionaires do not have your interests at heart. If they did, then they wouldn't even be billionaires. Do not fall for their attempts to relate to you. They cannot relate to us. We are nothing to them. We're peons. We're a means to an end. What we're living through right now has parallels in history. When the hierarchy of society becomes sharply stratified, when more and more people are ending up in the lower strata, when prices for essentials keep going up, when the vast majority of the wealth becomes concentrated among the few at the top, when it becomes practically impossible to move up the ranks of our political structure without enormous sums of wealth, when commercialism highlights extreme wealth disparity, when people run out of hope, become destitute, and have nothing left to live for, we know what happens next, and it isn't peaceful. That's why I'm hoping you, the wealthy and the powerful, the CEOs and the politicians, will choose peace by breaking this pattern and reversing each of these problems of your own volition. Platitudes and PR aren't going to work anymore. People will see through that. Words are no substitute for homes and food. The historical pattern is clear. Do something more material. Stop being billionaires. Pay your employees more. Wealth needs to be distributed fairly. Seeing as how you already have control over most of the wealth already, that responsibility now falls upon you. Because you are the ones who took it. Now it's time to give it back. At this stage of the historical pattern, it's probably getting close to being your last chance to do that. But I know you're not going to.